from our own Phil Edholm. He's going to show us his scratch build part 3 of an NMRA contest winner. And I want to thank Phil, another person I must talk to pretty much every day. Phil is very invaluable on the technical side, and he's the guy behind the curtain on the show here, and appreciate that. So with that, Phil, you're on.
Thanks, Tom. Let me go ahead and start our little slideshow here. So very briefly, we're continuing on these two buildings. We talked a little bit about the acrylic building, and then we went through in the session a couple of weeks ago on the concept of the 3D printed framing, kind of the 3D concepts, how to actually design and print the walls using a 3D printer. So what I'm going to do this week is talk a bit about kind of how you put it together, how it was finished, etc. So with that, kind of start with just a couple of shots of the process here. So if you look here on the upper left, those are actually wall pieces. Because the print bed, as I said, was 8x8, it turns out that when you look at the upper wall there, you actually could not print that as a single piece. So that's actually divided down the middle. The end wall there's actually two pieces. Down below, what you see is actually three pieces. As you remember, what we did was we molded in the 3D print. In the CAD design, we actually molded in locating pins. So those three pieces were joined together using just a little bit of epoxy. So I got very good at taking one of those two-tube epoxy squirt things, looks like a hypodermic needle, and pinching out two tiny little squirts, just a little bit of epoxy, mixing it up, and then you spread it between the two pieces, use the alignment pins, and just clamp it with those plastic clamps you buy at Harbor Freight. So what you see is kind of on the bottom left is starting to put it together. There's the end walls and side walls are glued together, but at the corners they're not glued. They're just pinned together at that point. If you notice on those, some of those don't have the roof elements. I ended up designing, like I said, this roof element to hold the roof on. So each of the roof trusses was designed with a hole at the right place. And the top of the walls had these couple of pieces so you could pin on the roof trusses. And what you see then on the right is kind of the way the building looked when I was getting it put together and thinking about how to put it together. You see the strip wood there for the siding that was going to go on it, the windows that were going to go in it. And as I looked at this picture, I realized that there was one thing I really forgot. Anybody think about what that might be? What is there not in that picture that you really would like in a building that you're doing a detailed interior on? You'll notice there's no lighting. And as I started thinking about how I was going to do lighting, I kind of went back to this idea of you can do things within the concept of the system. So I actually redesigned the trusses. So I actually have a box of trusses that all got printed and got thrown away. The trusses were redesigned, as you see on the upper left there, that included a extension to put a light fixture in. You can see on the bottom left there, these are those $10, $12 for 10 O-scale light fixtures you get from We Honest I think on eBay. And they were actually designed with holes to go through them. And then you'll notice that there are two brass rods, and the brass rods are designed to feed from either side of the building. So basically, the building's designed, I kind of like this concept of you put plus on one side of the building, minus on the other side, and then as you go across that, you provide power. So each of the lights, as you can kind of see there in the bottom right picture, each of the lights is wired up and soldered onto one of the two brass rods. And then, of course, after they were all finished, it actually looks very much like a real wall. And you see in the upper right is actually what it looked like when it was printing. This was printed down on the bed. So those arms that support the lights actually come up off the bed. So it prints very well as well. There's no supports in this at all. For those of you who are 3D printers, it's fairly easy to print. What you see in the next shot here is some more pictures just of some of the pieces there and how they came together and using pins. So you can see the lights there they were finished and detailed. I'm going to talk about that next. But you also see on the left there was a little hip truss that went under that forward-facing dormer that comes out of the building. That was actually built and printed as a separate piece. And again, you see the idea of using pins that pin that in. Is the lower left, it's actually pinned into the trusses on either side. And that piece is actually not glued in place. It's just pinned in place and held in that position by the pins and the straddling of the joist that's in between. Um, the other thing I did was also did a small, and this actually is the beginning of doing something that's maybe smaller framing. This is the office. So what you see on the upper left is the 3D printed framing. And then you see that with individual wood boards glued on to represent the walls. And then you can kind of see it installed in the lower right and from the outside. So kind of a nice way to build an office. When you look at it from the outside, it looks very much like raw, unpainted wood, redwood that is aged. And on the inside, if you kind of look down at the bottom right, it's actually painted kind of a greenish, a bluish green on the interior. So it kind of gives it a real contrast to the wood tones. So next, let me talk about texture and coloring. The G was so good it had to drop a line. So one of the key challenges I got into with this was when I got done printing it, how do you actually turn that into something that looks like it would be a wood model that was built up out of wood and was natural? And what that requires is that you obviously have to have the plastic look like the wood. So I'm going to walk through the steps that I use to do that. And some of these techniques I think are usable in a lot of different ways. So the first thing is, if you look at the plastic's smooth. When you print on a filament printer, as the layers print up, you actually get some level of kind of grooving on the sides between the layers. They're actually not completely flat. There's a little bit rounded. This was printed, I think, 1.12 millimeters. So there's a little bit there between the boards, but on the sides, that's actually what faces into the building that you're going to see. It's just flat plastic. So I had heard somewhere about the idea of using filler primer as a way to build up a layering to do things. So this was actually done with 4 coats of filler primer. So what you do is just take the plastic pieces, put them on a stick with some masking tape, and just sequentially spray them 4 times with Rust-Oleum filler primer. You can get this at Home Depot. It's used on cars to fill in scratches in the paint. What it does, it's not paint that's ground really fine. It has larger particles in it. It actually builds up layering that then you can sand off on the car to fill the scratch. But what's beautiful on the models is if you put 4 layers on, you now have enough paint buildup on there that if you use a razor saw, you can actually scrape across it and create wood grain. So what you see there in that kind of center picture, the wood grain there is actually that filler primer being scraped away with a jeweler's saw. So that was basically how the wood grain was done. Obviously, that was done, for example, on this piece before the brass rods were put in. The one in the center there is one of the trusses that you're actually seeing. So then the next step was finish painting. So what I looked at was I wanted to recreate something that looked like redwood. So if you've lived in places where there's redwood, obviously in California and especially in the Central Coast, redwood was the predominant building material. There was a lot of redwood up in the hills. Redwood, if you leave it out in the sun, it turns gray. If it's inside the building, it kind of turns a darker red, kind of a little reddish brown. It doesn't actually get gray. The gray comes from UV exposure. Inside a building, you don't have that UV exposure. So what I was trying to do was create in the boards, and I actually did these boards all separately, uh, a wood look that would have that variation you would have in natural redwood. So that was done with brown and mahogany shoe dyes with alcohol. One of the things I did a number of years ago was went on Amazon and bought about 10 or 12 different bottles of shoe dye, pretty reasonably priced. Mixed those up with alcohol, put them in mason jars with a piece of wood on the top, stained with what's in the jar. You now have basically a palette of colors that you can mix to create any color you want. So it's actually a good way to do wood staining and fairly inexpensive. Obviously, you could use one of the commercial products just as well, and they're very good. Um, so then once I had the wood done, the question was, how do you get the framing to match? But I wanted to have that reference colors on the wood before I started on the plastic. I actually tried spray painting it with dark colors, with some really light colors, and doing some dry brushing. And what I ended up coming up to was using this paint from Rust-Oleum called Caramel. And it's actually, you see it there on the right. It's a kind of lightish brown, had that reddish brown base tint that I wanted for what the wood was going to look like in the end. So essentially, after the wood was sprayed with the filler primer, scraped to give you the wood graining, it was then sprayed with this Rust-Oleum paint, the caramel paint. Now, one thing about that paint is if you look closely, you'll notice that it's actually kind of a semi-gloss. So it actually is not a matte paint. I was concerned about that. I almost always use matte paints when I paint because I really don't like the idea of that reflective color on it. It turns out because there was enough dry brushing on this, it really didn't come through on the final model. So after painting the base color, basically started dry brushing. And what you can see are the colors I used for dry brushing. There were 4 Vallejo colors. I started with the Vallejo wood, fairly heavy to give it that bit darker. Then a lighter of the Vallejo mahogany and golden oak. A little bit overall with Vallejo light brown to kind of tone it down a little bit. And then I used some brown and mud craft paints as well. Um, the one hint here is I'm not an artist. I'm an engineer. I'm very much on the engineering side of the scales. I am not a great dry brusher, but I happen to see on somewhere these Army Painter dry brush sets, and I think I paid $19 or $20 for a 4 brush set. And find that they do a really good job, and you can pick different sizes depending on what you're doing and the size of the piece you're working on. And if I combine those brushes with using a paper towel to wipe the brush out on, I've actually had pretty good results with dry brushing. So essentially everything was dry brushed after it was painted with a caramel. Um, then once that was done, and that, by the way, you only have to worry about the 3 interior sides. The outside of the framing where the wall is going to glue to, you don't have to really worry about it all. You definitely don't need to put the filler primer on it, and you really don't need to worry about much in terms of painting on it because what it's going to get on it, in this case, it got simply they're 1x8s, Northeastern lumber 1x8s. They were all stained as you saw before. Then once they were put in place, they were all put in place individually. They were then washed with black ink, and alcohol on the outside to give them a little bit darker appearance. And then they were dry brushed with just tube acrylic white, the bright white acrylic paint from Michaels. And then after that, dry brushed for effect. So you did a little bit of dry brushing after the dry brushing, did a little bit of rubbing them with a wire brush. One of the things you notice on the picture on the upper right is that I went back and put in nail holes. I think an O-scale nail holes actually uh, add to the model because they make it look more real. Quite frankly, they're probably a little oversized for the scale, but in terms of people looking at it, those nail holes actually I think add to the realism that people see. So what you see then down on the bottom is the walls were all finished completely to the white and through all the stages of the wire brushing without being assembled. And then the walls were assembled, as you see in the bottom left, and glued together on the ends again, glued with epoxy. Don't have to worry too much about how they look at the corners because the corners are going to get a trim piece on the outside to block it over. And then that basically then comes together into the model. So the next stage was putting the floor in. So as you saw earlier, the base of this building is a piece of masonite. The building is actually designed to come down over the masonite with a siding. So the masonite is actually represents part of the building, the bottom of the building from the perspective of how it would look. The flooring is just scribe siding, scribe material. Again, I think it's Northeastern. It was basically one of the things that's nice about this, it was epoxied onto the masonite. And you do that by mixing the epoxy and spreading it out very thin, not as dots, but as a smooth, thin overall. You want to cover almost all the wood on this. and then it was glued down and weighted onto the underlying wood. The nice thing about doing that is once you've glued down the scribe siding onto an underlying surface, you can now go back with an X-Acto knife over the scribes and cut them deeper. And that actually, scribe siding, if you buy, 1/32 or 1/16 scribe siding, the scribe lines are fairly shallow because if they go too deep, they'll start cracking the wood. But once you've glued the wood with epoxy to an underlying material, you can now cut those scribe lines much deeper and make them look like real boards. So you get a much more detailed appearance of the individual boards by doing that. Then after it was glued down and they were rescribed a little bit, I actually cut the board ends. One of the things I was started doing that and I realized it was incredibly tedious. And I was looking at my X-Acto knife and realized that if you grind the tip off the X-Acto knife to just the right width, you can actually make a cutter that fits right in between two boards and cuts that intermediate piece. So all of those inboard gaps were created with that little cutting tool that's just an X-Acto blade, ground down on a grinder sander to the right width. And then obviously going back and adding nail holes. Once this was done, then we added on top of this the building structure itself, and it was glued down. So it was glued down, as you see up above. It was epoxied down, just held down with some weight, and that basically put the building together. And it's now removable. So you literally, the beauty of this building is you can grab the ends of the building here and pick it up and move it. So next stage really talk about is the roof. So I decided I wanted to do the roof the same
Phil,
way. Yes, sir.
Phil, I think we're gonna have to do the roof next
We
show.
want to take the roof next show. We will call it there then.
But what I would like to do is open it up for any questions on to Phil on these techniques. So does anyone have any questions on his contest winner here?
Yeah, Phil, what did you use for to stain the floorboards?
Same thing. It was alcohol. It was again alcohol with shoe dye in it, and I used a couple of different colors and kind of put them on there. Again, and that was done after all of the work was done, the scribing on the scribe
Right.
marks and putting in the cuts and the nail holes.
It's a beautiful model, and we look forward to the part 4 and final segment, I believe next week.
Yep.